The Cabin Woods, Three Tales of Unseen Company. There is a specific kind of lie we tell ourselves when we rent a cabin out in the deep woods. We call it an escape. We tell our partners, we tell our friends, that we just want to get away from the noise of the world. We look at pictures of isolated timber walls, a warm fireplace, and miles of dense, quiet forest, and we think of it as a sanctuary. But isolation is a double-edged sword. The exact same trees that keep the rest of the world out also serve to trap you inside. When something goes wrong out there, the silence doesn't feel peaceful anymore. It feels heavy. It feels deafening. Because when you are miles away from the nearest paved road, you realize that if someone or something shows up on your porch in the dead of night, there is nowhere left to run. Tonight, we pull back the curtain on 3 chilling accounts of remote getaways that turned into psychological traps. These are not campfire ghost stories. These are documented encounters from people who thought they were entirely alone in the wilderness, only to realize they were sharing the dark with an absolute nightmare. Lock your doors, dim your screens, and listen very carefully to the woods outside. This first account is a harsh reminder that you never truly know what is going on inside the mind of a stranger, even if that stranger is sitting right across the room from you. This happened about 3 years ago. The endless, exhausting grind of everyday life was starting to take a serious mental toll on me and my girlfriend, Claire. We were burning out, and we desperately needed a break. She was the one who initially suggested renting a small cabin in the mountains for a long winter weekend, just a few days to disconnect and breathe. Naturally, I loved the idea. The only real problem was my bank account. I wasn't exactly rolling in cash at the time, and the nicer, more secluded properties were way out of my budget. Seeing my hesitation, Claire floated an alternative plan. My lifelong best friend, Mark, had recently gone through a sudden, incredibly messy breakup with his long-term fiancée. He was in a dark place mentally, drifting through his days. Claire suggested that we invite Mark along, turning the trip into a shared getaway. It would give Mark a chance to clear his head, and more practically, he could split the heavy cost of the rental right down the middle. I pitched it to Mark that same evening, and he jumped at the chance. He needed to get away from the empty apartment he had been brooding in. We wanted somewhere that felt incredibly cozy, somewhere with a massive stone fireplace where we could just watch the snow fall and listen to the crackle of wood. Claire spent hours searching online and finally found a beautiful 2-story cabin tucked deep into a dense valley of pine trees. We booked it for the final weekend of January. We spent the next week planning heavy meals, buying groceries, and packing warm clothes. But just 3 days before we were scheduled to leave, Mark called me. His voice sounded entirely different, shaky, hyperactive. He told me that he had met someone new, a woman named Elena. He claimed they had connected instantly over the last 48 hours, and he begged me to let her come on the trip with us. I was immediately deeply uncomfortable with the idea. I tried to explain to him that travel compatibility is a fragile thing, that bringing a complete stranger into an isolated cabin for 3 days was a recipe for an awkward disaster. When I told Claire, she agreed with me completely. We didn't want to spend our hard-earned vacation walking on eggshells around some random rebound that even Mark barely knew. But Mark begged. He practically sobbed over the phone, insisting that Elena was special, that she was quiet, sweet, and that we would absolutely love her. To sweeten the deal, he offered to pay for my entire portion of the rental out of his own pocket. Against our better judgment, we relented. We decided to make the absolute best of the situation. The weekend finally arrived, and the 4 of us carpooled out to the mountains in my truck. Mark introduced us to Elena in the driveway. At first glance, she seemed perfectly fine. She was thin, mousy, and incredibly quiet. Claire and I are naturally loud, conversational people, so we spent the first hour of the mountain drive trying to ask her questions, trying to get to know her. But Elena simply refused to talk. She would answer every question with a tiny, nearly imperceptible nod, or a flat one-word answer. By the time we pulled down the long, unplowed dirt driveway of the cabin, I still barely knew what her voice actually sounded like. The first evening started out normal enough. We carried our luggage inside, lit a roaring fire in the stone hearth, and sat around the living room to relax. Claire and I have a lifelong obsession with card games, especially high-stakes Uno. We love the simplicity of it, and we brought a fresh deck along. Claire pulled it out and suggested a game to break the icy silence. Everyone agreed. Even Elena seemed to show a faint spark of interest, coming out of her shell just enough to pull up a wooden chair. Seeing my desperation, The deputy was kind enough to offer me a ride into town in the back of his cruiser, promising we could arrange for my truck to be picked up the following morning. I grabbed my keys and wallet and we walked out into the freezing night air toward his patrol car. But as we stepped off the porch deck, the officer suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. He let out a sharp, shocked gasp. I asked him what was wrong. He slowly raised his flashlight beam, pointing it toward the tires of my truck parked in the gravel driveway. All 4 of my tires were completely hollowly deflated. The heavy rubber walls were ragged, violently sliced and slashed open with a thick blade. I completely unraveled right there in the gravel. The deputy did a fantastic job of keeping me grounded, physically guiding me into the back seat of his vehicle. He drove me to a small motel on the highway and stayed with me in the lobby until I could finally get in touch with my father early the next morning. My dad drove out at dawn to pick me up, helping me sort out the exhausting details of getting my ruined truck towed back to a mechanic. The owner of the cabin reached out to me via email dozens of times over the next month, offering endless apologies and trying to figure out what happened, but I simply didn't care anymore. I wanted the entire experience to be permanently buried. I didn't even bother asking for a financial refund. Some of my friends have floated the cynical theory that the cabin owner himself must have been involved in the nightmare, or that the owner was the actual man in the suit. But I know that's not true. The owner's public rental profile had verified photos of his face, and he looked absolutely nothing like the clean-cut stranger on my porch. I never got a single answer about who that man was, how he knew my name, or what he was trying to hide from out in those woods, and I am entirely certain I never will. I still get aggressive chills to this day whenever I think about that corporate suit. I hate knowing that somewhere out there, right now, that smiling, emotionless man is potentially still walking through the dark woods, terrorizing innocent people. The final account is perhaps the most unsettling, because it deals with the realization that sometimes the structural secrets of a building can allow a nightmare to live right alongside you without you ever noticing. About 6 months ago, my father passed away. I am not looking for any pity or sympathy when I say that. Our relationship was deeply strained and distant. He wasn't a bad man, necessarily. He just had absolutely no understanding of how to be a proper, supportive father to me specifically. At a very young age, I realized that my personality, my goals, and my values were the absolute polar opposite of his. I knew early on that I was never going to become the hyper-masculine corporate man he desperately wanted me to be, and I know that deep disappointment bothered him on a subconscious level for his entire life. So fast forward to 6 months ago when his will was read, and I was completely shocked to discover that he had left me his private hunting cabin in the mountains. A few of my close friends joked that this was my father, playing one final cruel joke on me from beyond the grave, forcing a remote piece of wilderness onto a guy who hated the outdoors. But I didn't see it that way. I knew the real estate market was hot, and I knew my father fully expected me to sell the property for a quick profit. I think that was his final way of providing for me. After a few months of dealing with the dry, boring legal paperwork, the real estate agent informed me that before we could list the cabin for sale, someone needed to physically go out there, deep clean the interior, and fix a few structural things that had fallen into neglect. I decided to use that chore as an excuse to stay at the cabin one final weekend. It felt like a proper, private way to say goodbye to his memory. But the moment I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, I was hit by a horrific, suffocating smell. It smelled overwhelmingly like rot, like death. And no, my father had not passed away inside the structure. He had actually been confined to a hospital bed in the city for nearly a year before his death, meaning the cabin had sat entirely abandoned for over 12 months. I spent the first hour frantically searching under the furniture and behind the appliances for a dead animal, a trapped raccoon or a deer mouse that had crawled inside to die, but I couldn't find a thing. I eventually assumed the place just stunk from years of stale air and my father's notoriously poor cleaning habits. The next thing that struck me about the interior was how frozen in time it was. The cabin looked exactly, down to the last detail, how it looked when I was 10 years old. He still had the exact same furniture setup, the same gross stained plaid couches, the same dusty bookshelves filled with old survival magazines. Literally everything was a monument to his past. I rolled up my sleeves and spent the next 5 hours deep cleaning every single inch of the downstairs floor, scrubbing the kitchen, wiping the dust, and spraying heavy disinfectant to kill that awful smell. Luckily, my father had paid a professional contractor to completely replace the roof a few years prior, so structural leaks were the one thing I didn't have to worry about. But while I was checking off items on my cleaning list in the afternoon, I kept hearing strange, faint noises coming from directly above my head. It was a soft, distinct rustling sound, followed by the slow, dragging friction of movement across timber. That was when a distant memory sparked, and I remembered that this cabin had an upper attic space. Calling it an attic is a major stretch. It was really just a tight, low clearance hybrid of an attic and a dark crawl space running the entire length of the roof line. There was a narrow hallway in the back of the cabin, and located squarely on the ceiling was an old wooden door with a frayed pull-down cord. I walked over, grabbed the cord, and pulled down. The spring-loaded door creaked open, and a heavy, retractable aluminum ladder slid down to the floorboards. I slowly climbed the metal rungs, fully prepared to be violently attacked by a nest of angry raccoons or squirrels that had breached the siding. But the moment my head broke through the ceiling threshold, I was hit by a wave of a smell so foul it physically made me choke. I had a violent coughing fit, my eyes watering from the stench. I clicked on my flashlight and swept the beam through the low, dark crawl space. The area was packed with old cardboard storage boxes. But the absolute worst part was the sheer amount of fresh, modern garbage littered across the insulation. There were crinkled plastic food wrappers everywhere, empty beer cans, discarded aluminum foil, and bags of half-eaten garbage scattered across the floorboards. I stood there on the ladder, completely disgusted. I knew my dad was never an immaculate, neat freak, but I also knew he was a proud, orderly military veteran. There was absolutely no version of reality where he would have crawled up into his own attic just to throw trash all over the floorboards. The terrible smell and the exhaustion of cleaning the downstairs grew to be too much for me. I wasn't mentally or physically prepared to go through dozens of filthy storage boxes at that moment. I picked up a small handful of the wrappers, climbed back down the ladder, and decided that the attic would have to wait until tomorrow morning. I took the trash outside to the bins, locked the doors, and headed to bed around 10 o'clock. I had placed some fresh, clean sheets over my dad's old mattress, trying to get some rest in his dark bedroom. But in the dead of night, I woke up suddenly. Through the heavy silence of the valley, I heard that exact same, distinct rustling sound coming from above my head. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, trying to rationalize it. I started to convince myself that the walls must have a massive, severe rodent infestation. That would explain the constant sounds of movement, and if a family of wild animals had gotten trapped and died inside the drywall, that would perfectly explain the horrific smell of decay. The only problem with my neat little theory was that the sounds were clearly too heavy to be mice. It sounded like something large shifting its weight directly above the ceiling panels. Since I was having a miserable time sleeping anyway, I decided to just plug my nose with my fingers, head back to the hallway, and check out the ladder. But the moment I stepped into the back hall, my blood turned to ice. The attic door latch was pulled wide open, and the heavy aluminum ladder was hanging all the way down to the floorboards. I froze, staring at the metal rungs. My mind tried to sprint backward to find an excuse. I told myself that I must have failed to latch the door properly earlier in the afternoon, and that perhaps a sudden gust of wind or a heavy animal shifting weight had caused the spring-loaded mechanism to drop down on its own. I cautiously walked up to the base of the ladder to push it back up into the ceiling. But as I reached out my hand, I noticed a fresh, brightly colored plastic snack wrapper sitting right on the hardwood floor, directly at the base of the metal steps. There was absolutely no wind inside this house, and a raccoon does not open plastic packaging. A sudden hot flash of pure anger cut through my fear. I assumed some local teenager or a homeless drifter from the highway had discovered my dad's cabin was empty over the last year, broken in, and was secretly crashing in the attic. I angrily snatched the wrapper off the floor, stormed into the kitchen, and threw it violently into the trash bin. I grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge, walked into the living room, and sat heavily on the plaid couch. It was pitch black in the living room, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was not going to be able to fall back asleep tonight. I decided I was just going to sit up until dawn. There was a small wooden end table next to the recliner with an old lamp on it. I reached over and twisted the switch. The bulb was old and weak, casting a low, dull orange glow across the room, but it was just enough light so I didn't have to sit in complete suffocating darkness. As the minutes ticked by, I sat there staring at the floor, thinking about my father, thinking about his life in this isolated cabin, and a strange logical question popped into my head. Why would a squatter or a local teenager choose to live in a dark, filthy, freezing attic crawl space when they had a completely empty, locked cabin with comfortable couches and a fully functional kitchen downstairs? If someone had broken into the house to live here, why compress yourself into a literal hole in the ceiling? While I was mulling over that question, my eyes casually drifted over to the far corner of the living room, and I noticed something weird next to the old fabric recliner. There was a large, heavy winter blanket draped awkwardly over something on the floorboards. That alone wouldn't be cause for panic. What made my heart completely skip a beat was the fact that I had spent 5 hours meticulously vacuuming and deep cleaning every single square inch of this exact room earlier in the afternoon. I knew for an absolute fact that there had been no blanket sitting in that corner when I went to bed. I slowly stood up from the couch, my muscles locking up, and took a cautious step toward the recliner. When I got within a few feet of the pile, I froze completely in my tracks. Protruding clearly from the bottom hem of the heavy winter blanket was the thick, tattered leather sole of a mud-caked work boot. I slowly, silently, took a long step backward, trying desperately to focus my eyes in the dim orange light of the lamp. I stared unblinkingly at the center of the blanket pile, and then the entire mass of fabric suddenly shifted. The blanket rose up about 2 inches, held for a second, and then sank back down. It was clear as day. Someone was lying curled up on the floor directly beneath that blanket. I hadn't been listening to wild animals in the walls earlier. I had been listening to the physical movements of a grown human being creeping down the attic ladder in the dark, walking into the room where I slept, and choosing to hide under a blanket just a few feet away from my face. I could clearly see the fabric rhythmically moving up and down from the slow, steady breathing of whoever was hiding underneath it. They were awake. They were listening to me. I didn't want to find out anything else about this person. I didn't want to see their face. I slowly, noiselessly retreated backward into the dark kitchen. I grabbed my truck keys and my phone off the counter, violently threw open the back door, and sprinted out into the gravel driveway. I jumped into my car, cranked the engine, and threw it into reverse, slamming the gas pedal down to back down the incredibly long driveway. And as my headlights swept across the front facade of the cabin, I looked through the windshield. The front door of the cabin was thrown wide open, and running out onto the porch deck was a terrifying, deeply unhinged-looking man. His hair was long, mangy, and matted with dirt. His clothes were literally falling apart at the seams, and his face was smeared with black filth. He didn't chase after my car, he didn't scream. He just ran out onto the wood and stood completely still under the porch light, watching my truck disappear into the dark forest. The moment I hit the main highway, I dialed the local sheriff's department and reported the intruder. When the deputies spoke to me the next morning, they explained that because my father had been absent from the property for nearly a year prior to his passing, this drifter had likely discovered an unlocked window, crawled inside for warmth during the winter, and simply moved into the attic space permanently. Judging by the volume of garbage and the severe intensity of the smell, the detective estimated that the man had been living secretly inside that attic crawl space for at least 14 months, which means he had been living up there in the dark, while my father was still alive and staying at the cabin. By the time the police cruisers had arrived at the scene the night before, the mangy man was long gone. He had vanished into the state forest, leaving behind nothing but his piles of filth. I never received any additional information about who he was, where he came from, or what his background was. I don't think his initial intention was to physically harm me. He clearly had dozens of opportunities to attack me while I was cleaning or sleeping, and he chose to hide instead. But that logical realization doesn't change the absolute psychological horror of knowing that I spent an evening sitting peacefully on a couch, completely unaware that a feral stranger was lying under a blanket just 3 feet away, watching me through the fabric. I never took a single step back inside that cabin after that night. I hired a private junk removal company to completely clear out the interior, without ever telling them what happened there. Maybe that makes me a jerk, but I just couldn't face that space again. They threw away every single relic of my father's past, and I sold the entire property as is to an out-of-state investor. I truly hope whoever owns that land now is happy with it, and I hope to God they never have to experience a surprise visitor looking down from the ceiling. 4 cabins. 4 isolated sanctuaries that quickly transformed into psychological hunting grounds. and not a single explanation that makes complete rational sense. I do not know what it is about the architecture of a remote home that makes people feel like they can cross the boundaries of sanity, like the quiet of the woods distorts the normal rules of human behavior. Whatever you do tonight, before you turn off your bedroom lights, check the locks on your doors. Make sure you know exactly who is staying under your roof. And above all, make sure you are the only one awake. But halfway through the very first round, we witnessed our first massive red flag of the weekend. Claire played her second to last card and clearly called out, "Uno." The moment the word left Claire's mouth, Elena froze. She slowly lowered her cards and her face contorted into an expression of pure, unbridled malice. Her mousy, quiet demeanor vanished instantly. In a loud, screeching voice that echoed off the high timber ceiling, she began to violently rip into Claire. We all kind of laughed at first, assuming she was just being intensely competitive, playing a joke, but our laughter only made her rage infinitely worse. Elena stood up so fast her chair screeched against the hardwood. She started screaming at the top of her lungs, accusing Claire of blatant cheating. She was hyperventilating, her eyes wide and bloodshot, screaming that there was mathematically no possible way Claire could only have one card left. Claire tried to defend herself, completely stunned, but Elena kept stamping her feet like an enraged toddler, shouting vulgarities at people she had met less than 5 hours ago. It was an outrageous, terrifying overreaction to a children's card game. When Mark desperately tried to reach out and calm her down, Elena violently slapped his hand away, threw her entire hand of cards directly into the burning fireplace, and stormed out of the room, slamming the basement door behind her. Mark looked at us, his face pale and burning with embarrassment. He stammered out a dozen apologies, promising us she was just stressed from work. We tried to laugh it off to save his dignity, but the cozy atmosphere of the cabin was entirely dead. Later that night, around 8 o'clock, Claire graciously made a heavy dinner. To our absolute shock, when Elena emerged from the basement, she seemed completely, perfectly fine. It was as if the terrifying temper tantrum from a few hours ago had been completely erased from her memory. She smiled, helped carry plates, and sat down to eat. But then came red flag number 2. While we were eating our dinner in the dim light, Elena started oversharing highly graphic, deeply disturbing details about her and Mark's private, intimate time together. She spoke with a flat, casual tone, describing incredibly personal, invasive things that no sane person would ever mention to strangers over a dinner table. I could see Mark physically shrinking into his seat, his eyes locked on his plate, radiating pure humiliation. I kept frantically trying to crack loud jokes, loudly interrupting her to change the subject to sports, to the weather, to anything else. Eventually, she stopped talking, and a suffocating, awkward silence settled over the cabin for the rest of the evening. We went to bed early just to escape the tension. In the middle of the night, around 2 in the morning, Claire violently shook my shoulder and woke me up. She whispered in the dark, telling me to listen to the walls. I sat up in bed, straining my ears. Through the thin drywall of the cabin, I could hear Elena and Mark arguing on the opposite side of the structure. Because our bedroom door was closed, I couldn't understand the specific words being thrown around, but the tone was horrifying. Elena's voice had that same screeching, volatile edge from the card game, while Mark sounded small, defensive, and deeply frightened. The absolute awkwardness of the situation was driving us crazy. We didn't want to make Mark feel any worse than he already did, so we decided to just pretend we slept through it. We vowed not to bring it up the next morning. The next day passed in a blur of uneventful tension. Mark looked entirely drained, distant, and hollow. He barely spoke to us. Elena spent the entire day locked inside their bedroom. We didn't see or hear from her once. It wasn't until the second night that the trip transformed into a living nightmare. Sometime around 3 in the morning, I woke up suddenly. My eyes adjusted to the pitch black of our bedroom, and my heart stopped. A large silhouette was standing completely motionless right over my side of the bed. Leaning over me in the dark, I let out a muffled yell, scrambling backward against the headboard. I reached out and slammed my hand against the lamp switch on the nightstand. The low light clicked on, revealing Mark. He was trembling violently. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and tearing up. He looked entirely terrified, like a man who had just seen his own execution. I gasped, asking him what the hell he was doing sneaking into our room. Mark sank to his knees beside the mattress, his voice dropping to a frantic, breathless whisper. He begged me, he pleaded with me, to let him stay in our room for the rest of the night, and he begged me to lock the bedroom door. I was completely confused and disoriented from sleep. I told him he needed to calm down and explain exactly what was happening. Mark swallowed hard, looking toward the closed door. He said that about 20 minutes prior, he had woken up in his own bed because he felt a cold draft. When he opened his eyes, Elena was standing at the very foot of the mattress, in the dark, just staring directly down into his face while he slept. When Mark asked her what she was doing, she didn't blink. She just shrugged her shoulders and said in a flat voice, "I am watching you sleep, just in case." Mark said they stared at each other in the gloom for a long, agonizing moment, and then Elena simply turned around and walked out of the bedroom into the dark cabin. Several minutes passed, and she didn't return. Mark started getting deeply anxious, worried that she was going to damage the rental property or hurt herself in the dark forest. He finally forced himself to get out of bed to go check on her. But as he slid his legs out from under the heavy winter blanket, his bare foot struck something heavy and cold hidden beneath the covers on Elena's side of the mattress. Mark pulled the blanket back. Lying flat on the sheets, right where Elena had been sleeping, was a massive, heavy carving knife from the kitchen counter. That was the exact moment Mark decided to flee. He quietly slipped out of the room, creeping through the pitch-black cabin toward our door, trying desperately not to make a single sound on the creaking floorboards. But as he crossed the threshold into the dark living room, he heard her. Elena was wandering around the dark space in circles, loudly humming a disjointed, chaotic melody to herself. Mark said she was swaying her body back and forth, almost dancing in the dark, skipping between the shadows. He said it looked like an elaborate state of sleepwalking, but something about the precision of her movements felt infinitely worse. As Mark crept closer to our bedroom door, his foot accidentally triggered a subtle creak in the hardwood floorboards. The humming stopped. Instantly, Mark frozen in the dark. Elena slowly turned her head toward his general direction, and in a deep, ominous, sing-song voice that didn't sound mousy at all, she whispered into the dark, "I see you." Mark swore that it didn't even look like her eyes were focusing on him. She was just staring into the empty space where he stood. After a few seconds of dead silence, she turned back around, resumed her low humming, and continued to skip around the pitch-black cabin. That was when Mark burst into our room and locked the door behind him. As I sat there trying to process this terrifying story, Claire woke up from the whispering. We sat huddled together on the bed, miles away from civilization, completely unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to believe she was just experiencing a severe, strange episode of sleepwalking, but the presence of the carving knife under the sheets completely shattered that theory. While we were whispering, trying to decide if we should call the police, we heard the heavy, distinct sound of bare footsteps pacing slowly outside our bedroom door, back and forth, back and forth. A few minutes later, a loud, echoing crash reverberated through the cabin. The heavy front door had been violently slammed shut. We waited a minute, summoned our courage, and cracked our bedroom door open. The living room was entirely empty. Elena was gone. Mark ran straight to the front window and stared out into the sub-zero mountain air. Through the glass under the faint moonlight, we watched Elena walking slowly into the freezing, pitch-black forest. She was wearing nothing but a thin white t-shirt and a pair of denim shorts, no shoes, no jacket, just walking straight into the dark woods. Mark let out a panicked sob and ran back into his bedroom to search for his phone. A second later, he let out a horrific scream from the dark room. The massive carving knife was gone from the bed. She had taken it with her into the forest. Claire insisted that we had to go out there and track her down, that we couldn't just let a woman freeze to death in the woods in the middle of the night, especially if she was experiencing a psychological break. But Mark grabbed Claire's arm, pleading with her, crying, begging us to just stay inside and call a park ranger. I have known Mark my entire life, through fights, through rough neighborhoods, and I had never seen him reduced to this level of absolute, paralyzing terror. He wanted absolutely nothing to do with her. While we were standing in the hallway, frantically arguing about whether to venture out into the freezing dark, the heavy front cabin door suddenly clicked open and then slammed shut. We all went completely, utterly silent. We held our breath, listening intently. From the front entryway, we heard the distinct, heavy sound of soaking wet, frozen footsteps stomping slowly down the hallway toward Mark's bedroom. She was still humming that exact same low, broken melody. We retreated back into our bedroom, locked the deadbolt, and pushed a heavy wooden dresser against the door. None of us slept a single second for the rest of the night. We just sat on the floor, listening to the random, erratic movements echoing through the cabin. At exactly 6 o'clock in the morning, the sounds shifted. We heard the distinct clatter of plates and running water coming from the kitchen. Elena was doing the dishes. We finally pushed the dresser away, opened the door, and walked out into the bright morning light together. Elena was standing at the sink, neatly wiping down a plate. She turned around, smiled warmly at us, and greeted us with a cheerful, "Good morning," as if absolutely nothing had happened the night before. Claire and I were so desperate to escape that valley that our brains tried to rationalize everything away. We chalked it up to a severe sleepwalking episode and figured Mark was just hyper-paranoid because of his recent emotional trauma. Everything we experienced was weird, sure, but we just wanted to pack up and get back to the city. Claire went into the kitchen to help her clean up, while I tried my best to console a deeply shaken Mark in the living room before he went back to his bedroom to pack his suitcase. Not even 2 minutes after Mark walked into his room, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Mark. It read, "Come to my bedroom right now. Do not say a single word to the girls. Just come." I walked down the hall, slipped into his room, and closed the door. Mark was standing over his suitcase, his hands shaking so hard he could barely hold his clothes. He pointed a trembling finger down at Elena's open duffel bag on the floor. He told me that while he was packing his own gear, he had accidentally bumped her bag off the chair. When it hit the floor, a heavy object had slid out of the side pocket. It was the massive carving knife, clean, dried, tucked away securely in her personal luggage. Looking at that steel blade hidden in her bag, a cold wave of pure horror washed over me. This wasn't sleepwalking, this wasn't an unconscious trance. She had consciously cleaned the weapon, concealed it, and packed it away. The 3-hour drive back to the city was filled with a suffocating, agonizing tension. Just sitting in the driver's seat, knowing that this quiet, smiling woman had that massive blade sitting in a bag between her feet, it completely wrecked my nerves. Thankfully, we made it back to civilization safe and physically unharmed. The moment we dropped her off, Mark ghosted Elena completely. He blocked her number, blocked her social media, and changed the locks on his apartment. And she must not have cared at all, because she never once tried to get back in touch with him. Over the last few years, Claire has occasionally tried to look up Elena on various social media platforms just to see what became of her, but she has never had an ounce of luck. She even went as far as searching local inmate lockup records and public court databases, and absolutely nothing ever comes up under that name. It is as if there is no official record of that woman ever existing, which makes us believe, with absolute certainty, that Elena was using a fake name from the very first night Mark met her. But if that's the case, what did she actually want from us? What was she planning to do with that knife under the blankets while we slept miles away from help? I guess it is something I will never truly know. But whoever she was, she had dark, predatory intentions. And we are incredibly lucky that, for some unknown reason, she chose not to act on them that weekend. The second account is told by a man named Victor, an extreme introvert who learned the hard way that sometimes the things we are trying to run away from in society are nothing compared to the things waiting for us in the dark. Over the last few years, I have systematically separated myself from the rest of the world. I have always been someone who naturally prefers to be alone. I don't love the company of others, and I actively avoid social gatherings, choosing to limit my interactions to a very select few people in my private life. A few years ago, I was at the absolute height of this introverted personality. My social anxiety had mutated into something severe. The simple thought of normal, everyday interactions with coworkers or strangers at a grocery store would send my heart rate into a panic. I went out of my way to find absolute peace and quiet. During this dark period of my life, I developed an extreme habit. Whenever I had the extra funds to make it happen, I would find the most secluded, remote cabins available online and rent them for the weekend, just to spend 48 hours completely alone in the wilderness. That might seem ridiculous or lonely to some people, but to me, those extreme lengths were the only way I could completely quiet my mind. This habit continued successfully for about 2 years, but during one specific weekend getaway, something happened that shattered my sense of security forever. The weekend started out completely normal. I found an incredibly isolated cabin located about 2 hours away from my hometown, buried deep in a state forest. I packed my truck and made the lonely trek out there on a Friday afternoon. My routine for these weekends was simple. I would spend the daylight hours hiking through the trackless woods, and the evenings cooking small meals and catching up on my reading. I love to read, and the absolute silence of the wilderness always helped me to relax and concentrate in a way the city never could. I arrived at the cabin on Friday evening, prepared a quiet dinner, read a few chapters of my book by the window, and went to bed early, feeling completely content. The next morning, I woke up refreshed and decided to take a long, ambitious hike deeper into the surrounding forest. I have always found a deep sense of peace being outside in nature. It doesn't matter to me if it's sunny, pouring rain, or freezing cold. I just love the absolute absence of human voices. But about an hour into my hike, the peace vanished. As I walked through the dense trees, I started hearing distinct sounds coming from somewhere behind me. The sharp, rhythmic snapping of twigs, the heavy rustle of dry branches being trampled. Under normal circumstances, you would just assume it was the natural sounds of wildlife, a deer or a foraging animal. But the rhythm of the sounds felt wrong. It sounded almost too deliberate, too synchronized with my own footsteps to be natural. I tend to be a naturally irrational, anxious person, so my mind immediately jumped to the absolute worst-case scenario. Someone was following me. I stopped dead in my tracks, spun around and scanned the dense brush behind me for several minutes. Nothing. The forest was completely dead silent. I was completely alone. I turned back around and kept hiking for a little while longer, but that heavy, suffocating feeling of paranoia just kept growing with every step. I had planned on pushing another mile into the woods, but the anxiety became too overwhelming to enjoy. I decided to cut the hike short and head straight back to the safety of the cabin. I had gotten to a point where the woods didn't feel peaceful anymore. They felt predatory. That evening was particularly rough on my mental state. Maybe it was a lingering hangover from the paranoia I felt on the trail. But a deep, heavy sadness settled over me. I felt incredibly lonely, trapped in my own head. To cope with the anxiety, I decided to pour myself a drink, and that single drink quickly turned into a few more. Once the alcohol started hitting my nervous system, the physical tension finally began to melt away. The anxiety disappeared, replaced by a warm, floating confidence. I tried to set down and read my book, but I couldn't focus. Instead, I turned on some loud music on my phone, poured another glass, and just started to vibe in the living room. It was right around 11 o'clock that night when the reality of the world came crashing back in. Through the loud rhythm of my music, I thought I heard a distinct knock at the front door. I froze. I immediately turned the music off, plunging the cabin into absolute silence. I stood perfectly still, my heart hammering against my ribs, making my way cautiously toward the entryway. The front door was a heavy, solid piece of oak with two small, rectangular glass windows set into the upper panels. I pressed my face against the glass and stared out into the pitch-black night. Nothing. The porch was empty. I let out a shaky breath, cursing the alcohol for making me jumpy. But before I could even turn around to walk back to the couch, another heavy, aggressive knock rattled the wood right in front of my face. I jumped backward, my breath catching in my throat. I forced myself to step back up to the glass and look out a second time. This time, someone was standing there. They were positioned just at the edge of the porch roof, where the thick shadows of the forest met the cabin. It was too dark to make out any specific facial features or details. It was just a tall, looming silhouette. Before I said a single word, I reached over and flipped the switch for the exterior front porch light. The bright bulb clicked on, completely illuminating the stranger standing on the deck. And my brain completely locked up, trying to process what I was looking at. The man standing on my porch did not look scary. He didn't look like a disheveled squatter, a dangerous drifter, or a wild mountain man. It was the absolute polar opposite. Standing out there in the middle of a pitch-black, isolated forest at 11 o'clock at night was a perfectly clean-cut man wearing an immaculate, expensive business suit. He was roughly 6 feet tall, with a strong, athletic build. His face was completely clean-shaven, and his dark hair was perfectly styled in a slicked-back, professional haircut. He looked like he had just stepped out of a high-end corporate boardroom, not a nighttime walk in the wilderness. He was utterly, terrifyingly out of place. I couldn't fathom why a man in a formal suit would randomly appear at a secluded cabin miles from civilization at this hour. Keeping the heavy oak door securely locked, I raised my voice and shouted through the wood, asking him if he was okay and what he wanted. There was a long, weird, almost unnatural pause before the man responded. It didn't look like he was struggling to find his words. It looked like he was a machine, processing the audio of my voice before formulating a calculation. Then, he finally spoke. He said that he had been driving on the main highway with his girlfriend earlier in the evening when their car broke down. He claimed he had spent the last 3 hours walking through the dense woods looking for help, and now he was completely lost. He asked if I could please open the door and let him inside so he could use a phone to call a tow truck. On its own, that story sounds like a perfectly reasonable emergency. But the absolute most unsettling part of the encounter was the complete and total lack of any human emotion in his voice. He did not sound like a man who had been lost in a dark forest for hours. He didn't sound frantic. He didn't sound tired. He didn't sound worried about his missing girlfriend. His voice was a flat, dead drone, completely void of any human energy. A wave of intense survival instinct washed over me. I told him through the door that I would not be opening the house, but that I would call the emergency services for him. I instructed him to step off my porch, walk down to the very end of the long driveway, and wait by the dirt road for the police to arrive. The man paused again. His eyes slowly roved around the exterior walls of the cabin, taking in the structure. Then, with that exact same flat, lifeless delivery, he said, "I really need to come inside. Something is out there in the woods, and if I don't get inside right now, I am going to be in trouble." The sheer amount of tension I felt in that room is almost impossible to describe. I felt like I was staring at a predator mimicking human speech. I raised my voice, aggressively telling him that I was dialing 911 right now, and that he could either wait by the road or leave the property immediately. But there was no version of reality where he was crossing my threshold. As I turned my back to walk toward the kitchen counter to grab my phone, I heard his voice drift through the glass pane again. He didn't sound desperate. He just calmly said, "I want to hide inside the cabin. I am in trouble, and I need to hide inside with you." The moment my fingers gripped my phone, the calm demeanor outside violently shattered. The man suddenly began to aggressively, frantically, pound on the heavy oak door with his fists. The wood was shaking in its frame. I ran back to the entryway, terrified the glass would shatter, and began to scream every vulgar, threatening thing I could think of through the panels, trying to make myself sound dangerous. But in the middle of my frantic rant, I stopped talking, because through the thick wood, I could hear the man outside loudly laughing. It was a horrible, high-pitched, mocking laugh, and it was by far the most genuine human emotion the stranger had shown since he arrived on my porch. I forced myself to look through the small rectangular window. The man had stepped directly up to the door. His face was practically pressed flat against the glass pane, just a mere 2 inches away from my own eyes. He stared straight into my pupils, and in a perfectly calm, low, conversational voice, he said, "Come on, Victor. Just open the door already." A cold shockwave paralyzed my entire body. This total stranger, this man in a business suit out in the middle of an isolated forest, somehow knew my name. I stood there frozen for several seconds, my brain completely short-circuiting. Then, working entirely on raw survival instinct, stabbed at my phone screen, dialed 911, and frantically told the operator that a strange man was actively trying to breach my remote cabin. The moment I hung up the phone, I forced myself to look back through the window. Porch was completely empty. The porch light illuminated nothing but empty wooden planks. He had vanished into the shadows the exact microsecond I completed the call. For the next 15 minutes, I waited for the authorities to arrive. And for every single consecutive second of that wait, I never once took my eyes off that window pane. I didn't see a single shadow move in the driveway. I didn't hear a single twig snap. Finally, a single police cruiser pulled down the long dirt driveway, its headlights cutting through the gloom. I threw the door open, sprinted out to the car, and let the officer inside immediately. I poured out the entire story, my voice shaking, completely unraveled. The deputy looked genuinely concerned, but deeply confused. He told me that there were only a handful of seasonal residents within a 5-mile radius of this valley, and none of them had reported a single strange occurrence tonight. This was the first emergency call the county had received all evening. The deputy could see that I was an absolute nervous wreck, physically vibrating with shock. He gently suggested that I pack up my immediate belongings, drive into the nearest local town, and check into a hotel for the remainder of the weekend just to clear my head. I looked at him, gesturing to my empty glass, and admitted that I had been drinking heavily and that I didn't feel legally or physically comfortable operating a vehicle on these treacherous mountain roads. But I flatly refused to stay in that cabin alone.